you. So I'll just get the old sharey screeny up. There we go. Great. So yes, it's going to be covering hints and tips on applying for grants. So whilst obviously some funders have got specific criteria, this is going to sort of cover generally what to consider when obviously looking at applying for grants. But obviously when you look to get to a specific funder, then I'll cover in this as well, making sure that you read through the guidance for all the specific criteria that a funder might be looking for. So the first thing is obviously as a group is making sure that you have systems in place. There are a lot of funders out there, but mainly they'll be funding organisations rather than individuals. There are, of course, a few who do. There's always exceptions. So, for instance, the Arts Council are happy to fund individuals. But for a lot of funders, as I said, they're going to be looking for you to have to be some kind of organisation. So having at least 3 people who ideally are not related and don't live in the same house, to have made up some kind of committee or board as an organisation. So the first thing to consider is, have you formed that group yet, and have you got the right people? Do you have a constitution? So that is the governing documents and the basically the rules by which your organisation is going to run by. Then it's thinking about, have you got the basic team systems in place? So for instance, looking at who is going to be taking responsibility for implementing policies like child protection, if you're going to be working with young people, if you're going to be working with vulnerable adults, if you've got a policy regarding that. Then things like, are you going to have committee meetings that are going to be noted and minuted? So thinking about those basic systems that you need in place to have sort of what we would call governance over your organisation. Then part of that is also having financial systems in place. So having a community bank account, or a bank account that's in the name of your organisation. I'll just mention as well that as an organisation, there's lots of different types of organisations that you can be. Obviously, the larger ones, like becoming a charity, or the sort of more formal ones. And then there's things like becoming a community interest company, or which is sometimes called a CIC, or there's a CIO, which is a community interest organisation. And then there's sort of being an unincorporated volunteer group as well. And the local infrastructure organisations in Northamptonshire can help you on the road to becoming one of those and what would be best suited to you. And the local infrastructure organisations are the ones who are sort of hosting these virtual events at the moment. So Voluntary Impact Northamptonshire, Daventry Volunteer Centre, South Northants Volunteer Bureau, Nen Valley Community Action, Kettering Volunteer Network. And there's also one in Corby as well. So having contact with your local infrastructure organisation would help you at this beginning stage about becoming an organisation which is ready to be able to receive grants. So once you've got that point in those setups in place, and you have that bank account which has got 2 signatories, which is going to help decrease the risk of grant fraud or fraud in general, the next stage is to think about project planning. So thinking about who you want to target with your work. So is it young people? Is it older people? Is it your local community? Is it going to be sort of what we would call NEET, so people who are not in education? Obviously, it can be a whole different range, but identifying almost who's your target market that you want to help. Then thinking about, why do they need a project? So why do they need your services? Then thinking about when you want this project to happen, where do you want it to happen, and how are you going to go about delivering it? And then once you've thought about that, then the next stage would be thinking about how you would demonstrate the difference that any funding or any project would make to those to that community. And I'll go into a bit more detail in that later on. So this is sort of part of your working out an action plan. So again, thinking about those first few steps. So thinking about what you want to achieve and how you're going to do it. So TGROW is a bit of a random acronym, but we'll go with it. So T, which is the topic. So what is the issue that you are trying to cover? So it could be you want to tackle child poverty, you want to improve health and well-being, you want to reduce isolation. So thinking about what is that topic, that area of need that you're trying to either improve or reduce or increase access to. Then you have a goal. So what are the aims of the project? So it could be, for instance, if the issue is that obviously you've got maybe lack of affordable exercise available in your community, and the aims are that you are going to try and get funding so that you can get a fitness coach to provide community fitness sessions, and it's all about improving health and well-being. Then the R is about reality. So where are you now? So that's taking the time to stop and assess what you already have available to you. So for instance, you might have a look at your organization and go, right, actually, we've got somebody who has the skills to develop and lead this project, but we don't have a venue. So that's something that we need funding for. Or you might, for instance, have a venue, but you don't have the expertise to be able to realize the project. So that's thinking about what you already have and what you need, and what you're looking for funding for. Then options. So what are the possibilities? So that's about thinking about, are there any organizations that you could connect to? So we talk about if there's anything in kind that you could get from another organization. So some groups might let you use their community hall for free or a reduced cost. You might have, as I said, a volunteer who might be able to help out, who might have some expertise or skills. So thinking about what are the possibilities. And then also the last one, which is W, which is will. So how committed are you? It sounds, whenever I read this out, I always think about being committed and being sectioned, but the drive and will that you have to make sure that you can see a project through to the end. The reason for that is that a lot of the time projects might take 6 months from when you first initially have that idea to then get into actually happening. So that's thinking about the time that it takes to organize, the time it takes to plan and apply, and then the grant application process itself can sometimes take somewhere between 8 to 12 weeks just to hear back in terms of whether an application has been successful or not. So that will and commitment to seeing an idea through is actually quite important in terms of whether you're going to undertake a project. So research. So how do you know that there is a need, and can you evidence this? So consulting your beneficiaries. That's because some funders within their application will want to see how your beneficiaries or the service users have been involved in the decision making of the project. So that could be doing some local research. So it could be simply speaking to people that are part of that community that you're wanting to work with. Another option could be looking at data. So, for instance, on Northamptonshire Community Foundation's website, we have a section called Northamptonshire Insights, and on there's both data sets from Local Insights, which draws down data from lots of different national data sets on health, crime, all sorts of things. And then we also did a hidden needs report a few years ago with the University of Northampton, which looked about priority needs in particular areas of the county. So having both hard and soft evidence can really help an application in terms of demonstrating to the funder why your project's needed. As I said, you can use that data, use that perhaps anecdotal information to support the need. And of course, if you've done a project before and you have through the process collected evaluation and monitoring material to show that it's been effective and that it needs to carry on, that can also be part of that process as well. So, and it's also important to double check if there's anybody out there who's doing the same thing or a similar thing. And this is about making sure that you aren't duplicating work that already exists or duplicating services that already exist, because it's likely that funders will know of these other organisations and will want to know, A, if you're aware of them, and B, how it's not duplication, how you're not delivering the same service to the same group of people. So read the guidance. So number one, big important thing is checking that you're eligible to apply. Each funder is going to be slightly different. And if you're attending more than one of these webinars throughout this virtual funding fair, you'll see that everybody's slightly different. For instance, Northamptonshire Community Foundation, we only fund organisations that are based in Northamptonshire and benefit Northamptonshire. Whereas we've got other organisations which are national, some support CICs, some don't, some support schools, some don't. So it's making sure that you'll really read that eligibility and double check before you start the application process. And also that comes into whether your project and group match the criteria. There are some funds out there which are quite general in terms of what they're hoping to do. So whether it's just improving the community, and that can be quite general and you can fit most project ideas within that. Whereas some others are going to be more specific. And again, an example of what we've got at the Community Foundation, one of our funds, the Compton Fund, is about arts, culture and heritage. So if your project doesn't fit that, there's no point applying to it. It will be a waste of your time because it doesn't fit and it will just be declined. So if you're ever unsure about whether you're eligible or whether a fund fits or not, then it's best to always contact the grants officer, speak to the funder themselves via email, by phone, and just have a conversation, because it will likely save you time in the long run. And if they don't think that your project fits one of the grants that they have, they might be able to direct you to an appropriate fund or funder. Also, having a look at previous case studies of what's been funded before, I think is a really useful way of gauging whether your project might fit with them. Having a look at what they've previously funded can give you an idea of what kind of projects they're looking to support. And of course, it's not shoehorning your project in to fit a fund, because again, it will likely mean that your application that you've probably spent many hours over is going to be turned down. So always check the eligibility, always read the guidance and have a chat with the funding officer. Planning your application. So it's making the most of your application. So ensure that whoever is listed as the main contact is well briefed on the project. This is because there are funders and there are on particular occasions applications where the assessor of the application will want to have a chat with that main person. So making sure that they're well briefed, that they understand what the project is about, they can answer questions. They have, for instance, you might send them a copy of the application if they weren't the ones who necessarily wrote it out. Doing a draft version of the application is always recommended, and also getting somebody else to check it. So it could be someone within your organisation, it could be a critical friend, or in some cases it could be your local infrastructure organisation. Depending on their services, they might be able to review applications, draft applications, before you submit them. And at Northamptonshire Community Foundation, because I don't sit within the grants panel, I'm able to have a look at draft applications to our organisation before they're submitted. So don't assume that the funding organisation is going to know who your group is or your track record. This is because obviously funders often get applications in, hundreds of applications, if not thousands of applications a year. And even if you have a previous relationship with that funder, the people who are actually, for instance, having a look at the assessment, they might be new to the organisation, or they might not have heard of you before. So it's basically not assuming that your reputation is preceding you. You'll be judged on the quality of the application that you send in, rather than your reputation or previous relationship with the funder. Use the space on the form well. So that's making sure that there's relevant information in there about the project. So it's remembering to mention what the activity is that you want to do and why do you want to do it. Those are sort of really two important things to make sure that you're including in that. Also allowing yourself plenty of time. So that's obviously time to plan and prepare your application, so that you make sure that you meet the deadline for applications. But it's also thinking about when the funding decisions will be made. So for instance, we've got funding rounds. Oh, someone's at the door. I'll just have to ignore them. I hope they don't get upset. No. So as I was saying, you have to sort of think about, if you're, for instance, with our funding rounds, we have an application deadline at the start of August, but that funding decision, that funding panel, isn't going to take place until the end of September. So that means groups won't find out if they've been funded or not until the start of October. So that's sort of like roughly an 8-week wait. So if you know that you want to do a project that's in October, November, you know that you're going to have to start planning this in June, July, in order to get in an application for August. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about timescales, is thinking far enough ahead in advance. Because if you have an event or a project taking place next month, it's very unlikely you're going to find a funder who will be able to give you a funding decision in that short time scale. So making sure you describe the project and not what you want to achieve. So sometimes what can happen is that people say, we want to alleviate child poverty. We think that that is, an issue that we need to tackle. And they'll talk about what they, they'll talk about the sort of the overall sort of purpose of the project, but they won't describe how they're going to do it. So they won't include the information of, we're going to include child poverty by doing, let's say, food boxes to schools so they can have a breakfast club, and it will happen, we'll make deliveries twice a week. They'll miss out that detailed information because they'll just end up explaining that overall arching goal, rather than that nitty-gritty detail that funders need to know. And again, it's that who, why, when, where, and how questions that you need to think about. So creating a clear picture for a grants panel or an assessor, so that they can really understand what the project's going to look like. And I said that's covering, if you cover those questions of who, why, when, where, and how, that's really going to help the understanding of the assessor or the grants panel in what you're wanting to achieve. So budgeting accurately. So not guessing figures and not overinflating your budget. So taking the time to do some research, to get in quotes, particularly if it's for capital work that you're wanting to have, then that's really vital to make sure that you're checking those, because often funders will have a rough idea from previously funded work how much things cost. So we'll be able to normally spot if figures don't seem to make logical sense. Making sure that you provide as much information as possible. So making sure that the budget that you provide is detailed. So for instance, if you're wanting staff costs covered, so putting how many members of staff, how many hours of work, what that works out as an hourly rate, or if it's part of a sort of like an overall sort of, if it's coming out of what their normal salary, for instance, sort of what percentage that is, because that's all going to help the assessors and the grants panel understand whether this project is sort of like a value for money project. Allowing for a range of budget themes. So obviously, if you're putting in for a project, if you need to cover admin costs, if you need costs towards a venue, if you need costs towards buying equipment, running costs of your building, anything like that, whether it's printing of flyers or any other PR and comms in terms of putting social media adverts out, anything like that, then making sure that that's included within your budget. So the amount of monies you apply for should cover all of the costs. So as I said, it's talking about that administration and overhead costs, as well as those more sort of operational activity costs. And again, just as you shouldn't inflate a budget, you shouldn't underestimate it either, or create or set out unrealistic wish lists of what you want. And again, as part of that budgeting, it's having appropriate financial systems in place. So having somebody who is acting as the treasurer, having, as I said, that appropriate bank account, making sure that that's being checked regularly by more than one person, so that the funder can see that there's going to be, it's not likely that there's going to be grant fraud taking place. So make sure that the information is easy to read and understand. And that, again, links down to sort of avoiding abbreviations unless defined beforehand. So I would say this is something that particularly comes up with, for instance, us as a community foundation, because we don't fund specific we're not a specific cause funder. So unlike, for instance, let's say the Arts Council, where their bread and butter of grants is arts and culture and heritage, and so might be more familiar with any terms around arts and culture. For instance, a more general funder like us as a community foundation, or perhaps even the National Lottery, where you're going to be dealing with lots of different types of groups and lots of different types of areas, we aren't necessarily going to know all of the abbreviations or terminology that you might use within your sector. So making sure that it's really clear when you're writing out your application. And again, it's that proofreading, having a draft application, making sure that someone else can double check for you, making sure that your budget adds up and balances. That's another common thing that happens, is that people don't check the sort of the budget accurately, and then there's questions about why things don't add up. Making sure that somebody else can quickly go over these for you before you press that submit button. And so this is talking about measuring impact, which I mentioned at the start. So that monitoring and evaluation process when you're putting in an application. So if you've received funding it's making sure that you've completed all the necessary forms from that prior funding grant. So in terms of us, we call it an end of grant report, but other funders might have different names for it. So making sure that you're up to date and things are signed off before you submit another application. And then in terms of monitoring, thinking about when you put in a new application, how you're going to measure and record the difference your project is making. So how are you going to know if your project is having a positive impact on the people attending it? And so you might want to think about things like surveys, you might want to think about interviews, photos, assessments, but you need to think about that at the start of the project, because at the end you'll have to have a report, which means throughout the project you need to be collecting that information. Because of course, if you get to the end of the project and you go, oh, I've got to do a report, but everyone else, everyone involved has now moved on with their lives, now I have to go back and chase people for information which you could have been collecting throughout the project. So it's having that in mind at the start, before you apply, and then carrying it out throughout the project, so it's not a big nightmare at the end when you come to submit your end of grant report or any other type of monitoring and evaluation. Most local infrastructure organisations should be able to provide some training or information on this. I know that Voluntary Impact Northamptonshire are going to be doing a webinar or workshop on this later on in the year, I think around October time, which NCF is going to be supporting as well. So there is information out there if you're unsure and you want a bit more help around that. So to sum up, it's about having the right people in place, making sure that you've got a clear idea about what you want to do and how you're going to do it and why you need to do it, to talk to other people and do your research before submitting, and then making sure that you read the information, read the guidance, take advice, and if you can, get other people to have a look at draft applications before submitting them. So here is my contact information and my colleague Anthony's contact information at the Community Foundation. If you would like to talk about any grants that are connected with us at NCF, or if you are wanting to sort of have a bit more information about what we've spoken about today. But that is the end of that. So I suppose we'll have to see. I can see there isn't any questions in the chat.
Nothing in the chat yet, no.
But does anybody have any questions other than who was at my door? We'll never know. Let's have a look. I don't think I can. Can I see? I can't see any hands up.
No.
No. Okay, well, it looks as though I've done an excellent job and I've answered everything within the presentation, so I get a gold star. But seriously, if anybody does have any questions, don't feel like, oh, I can't ask a question, it sounds too silly.
No, there's no such thing as a silly question.
Exactly.
Ooh.
No, everyone's just saying how amazing I am. That's really nice of them. Great. That's wonderful. Well, I imagine also that a lot of people are getting any answers to questions that they might have through the webinars that are taking place, and be able to obviously ask those specific questions to those specific funders, this is obviously a fantastic opportunity that's been put on for organisations to have a chance to have those questions and get that information, which is great. And hopefully you feel from attending this virtual funding fair that all of the funders, no matter how big or small, that they are all approachable and that you can just pick up a phone, send an email, and they are happy to give you advice, no matter, as I said, whether they're national or local. So hopefully that's taken away any fear that people might have about taking their sort of first steps into getting funding.
Lovely. Thanks, Alex. And thanks everybody else for joining us. Just a final reminder that if you'd like to do an evaluation form for us, if you could go to the same website you booked your places on and complete that. And if you want to be entered into the prize draw, if you could just leave us your details, that would be great. So thank you all. Have a nice afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you for some more sessions. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.